everyone. I hope you're doing well. Thank you so much for coming to this prestigious event here at the Scott Institute for Energy Innovation. For those of you still getting food, we do have additional chairs up towards the front. Please do fill in. I want to make sure that we have everybody seated. So if you'll just move up towards the front, that would be very helpful. So before I get started, I wanted to do a couple of safety announcements. For those of you who are unfamiliar with this building, should there be an emergency, you simply go straight out that back door. You can also use this front door, and we would head towards the campus entrance, which is right on the 5th floor. So that's where you would head. For those of you who need a restroom, the men's room is in this direction, and the women's room is in that direction. So please make yourselves at home. We're so glad to have you here. We are recording this event, so please do silence your cell phones or anything else that might make noise. We would appreciate that. I think that for the most part, we're going to go through our presentations this morning and hold questions till the end. This is a 2-hour session, so if you need to leave to get to a class, etc., please do just quietly make your way back towards the back. There's plenty of food, so make sure you have some food as well. Ordinarily, I would give you some announcements of upcoming events, but because it's the summertime, we don't have as many upcoming. I do want to make you aware that we've already set the date for Energy Week for next year, believe it or not. It is March 23rd through the 27th of 2020. So you can go ahead and put that one on your calendar. So without further ado, we have a very dynamic presentation this morning that is the culmination of many, many, many months of work and a lot of hands. So I want to make sure that we get right into the meat of the conversation. The first thing I want to do, though, is I want to introduce our 5 distinguished guests this morning, and I want to welcome all of you here. So our first speaker this morning is Ryan Unger. He's with Team Pennsylvania. He's the president and CEO. He joined the staff in 2011 to guide Team PA's policy work, and over the years, he's transitioned from his public policy role to vice president and COO, and eventually president and CEO. He's a native of Pennsylvania. Directly next to him is Dr. Katrina Kelly-Pitou, who currently acts as the Director of Urban Systems for SmithGroup here in Pittsburgh. She has years of experience in public policy planning and infrastructure development at various levels of governance, including the World Energy Council, and most recently at the University of Pittsburgh. She has a PhD in energy development studies from the University of Nottingham. Moving over again, we have Denise Brinley, who currently serves as the Executive Director of Governor Wolf's Office of Energy, which is a new office. It's a newly formed office that's housed within the Department of Community and Economic Development. Brinley coordinates energy-related matters among state agencies and serves as the first point of contact for federal agencies, businesses, nonprofits, and other organizations in the energy sector. In this role, she will convene and guide the Community Energy Collaborative, a multidisciplinary energy agency-focused effort to align numerous energy efforts and develop long-term energy strategies for Pennsylvania. Formerly, Brinley was a senior energy advisor at DCED, focusing on Pennsylvania's energy advantages by working with economic and workforce development partners to retain and grow our energy industry, and by marketing and attracting potential investors. Next, we have Carnegie Mellon alumnus Andrew Place, who serves as the commissioner on the Pennsylvania Public Utility Commission. So with a background in business, academia, state government service, and agriculture, he brings a unique blend of insights to the Commission's efforts to balance the needs of consumers and utilities. And finally, we have Adam Walters, who is the Senior Energy Advisor serving in this newly formed Governor Wolf's Office of Energy, where he is committed to developing an integrated approach to energy matters across Commonwealth agencies. He works with public, non-governmental, the private sector to assist in planning, implementing, and promoting energy-related activities and initiatives. He earned his Master's of Public Policy Administration from Penn State University and holds a bachelor's degree in International Relations. So I made it through all of those bios. Congratulations. Thank you so much for being here. And with that, I'm actually going to pass it over to Ryan.
Stay seated. Well, thanks everybody for coming today. Yep.
They'll actually be able to see
Okay. Okay, answer my question. Denise is 0 for 1. Okay, no. So again, thanks everyone for coming today in the midst of busy summer schedules for a 2-hour conversation about the future of energy. Great way to spend your summer, and we appreciate you coming today. A little bit about the process, what we do, how we got here today, and a little bit about Team Pennsylvania as well. Team Pennsylvania is the state's public-private partnership focused on economic and workforce development. Founded in 1997 by Governor Ridge as a place where really business leaders could come together, the leaders of business with the leaders of the public sector, to solve big problems. And that's what we're doing today and talking about, a really big challenge and a really big opportunity for the Commonwealth of Pennsylvania and what we're going to do with energy over the next 25 years. And that's what we found out and done throughout our entire time at Team Pennsylvania. I want to especially thank Carnegie Mellon for their support of Team Pennsylvania. On our board of directors, Tim McNulty is here today, President Jahani, and also on the board, Tim, an alternate to the board, and supports this work that we get to come today. Tim also participated in the Energy Horizons process that you're going to hear about today. And really the underpinning and the reason we came to do this and support this work is based out of a conversation with leaders of the public sector and leaders of the energy industry, where we talked about how we never seem to get out of our corners when we talk about energy. We either 100% on one side, 100% the other, and we see this all around us, right? And we're going to talk a little bit about some of the data of political polarization and why it leads us to those different areas. But we can never have this conversation in what a lot of our friends call the rational middle, about what is the possible, and that's what we're going to talk about today as we go forward. And we have a saying at Team Pennsylvania that really undergirds a lot of our work and what we talk about, in that science without policy is science, but policy without science is gambling. And it undergirds and supports all the endeavors that we take place. We've done activities in agriculture, and it's rooted in an economic impact study. We do work to support the petrochemical industry, supported by a large report done by IHS Markit about the opportunities in the Commonwealth of Pennsylvania. And that is what we're here today. We're going to continue to support the work of Governor Wolf and the leaders of the energy industry, but it needed to be undergirded and supported by some good science and some really good data, and that's what we're going to bring to you today. So I appreciate your time. I'm going to turn it over to the experts that really led this process, and I think, Denise, are you up first? Or Katrina? Katrina will be up next.
Take that.
You have the mic, right?
We're good on the mic.
You got it.
So thank you, everyone. Thank you for CMU for having us today, and of course, thank you to Team PA for helping and can we fix this a little bit? No worries. You can just shout if you want me to. Is this better now? It's great to be at a technical university. So thank you for having me today, and thank you everyone for coming to hear about all of the great work that we've been doing with Team Pennsylvania for the past few years now. I can just hold it like this. I get to have a bit of a...
We get to start off.
I was going to say, I'm a shouter. Is it okay? Great. Yeah. We're good? Cool. I feel like I can really... I can just speak now?
Yep.
Great. As several people in the audience can attest, a few previous students that I've worked with, I'm a bit of a shouter, so hopefully everyone can hear me in the back of the room. If not, we'll get on with it. It'll be fine anyway. I'm very excited to be here today to get to do something a little bit fun, which is just introduce the topic of scenarios to you and help you get into the mindset and the correct anticipation of all of the work that's going to come. I have the unique capability of being both a Pennsylvanian and a Pittsburgher, but also someone who's worked at the global level. So today I'm just going to be talking to you a little bit about what the context of what we're talking about today, why it's important even to have this conversation, and really what the work set out to originally do. So how many of you have heard the word?
It's the wrong presentation.
It's the wrong presentation. Well, I can talk through it.
Okay.
Is it okay?
Yeah.
We have the wrong presentation. See, we're resilient here. But how many people, can you just raise your hands casually, how many of you have been part of an energy scenarios exercise before? Good, that was the small amount I think that we were all hoping for here. So just to give a bit of nerdy context and a little bit of an excitement about what we're starting here today is the why and what are scenarios even. What are we doing this and what is it for? As we know today, energy is always an important part of our economy. It's what's used to keep our lights on. It's what's used to keep our hospitals powered. It's how we get to work every day, and it's how we basically fuel our economy and, most importantly, our economic development. Since 1974, though, it's been really difficult to predict how energy impacts all of those things in our daily lives. Energy used to occur in kind of a straightforward curve of predictability, if you will, but the gigantic oil crash that happened in the mid-70s really caused energy decision makers and energy leaders to come together and ask the question, what didn't we predict correct, and why have we failed to do so? Ironically and very excitingly, a group of researchers at an organization called RAND, which many of you are hopefully familiar with in this Pittsburgh area, worked with a global network of CEOs at the energy level, both internal to governments and also internal to private corporations, to help come up with a methodology for how they could predict the future. We still keep the heart of our quantitative predictions as the centerpiece of the work, as we will today, but scenarios is more about understanding on-the-ground intelligence, if you will. How are the things that we can't capture in numbers, how do these influence what we see unfolding in the future? And how can we come to describe the utter complexity that exists around the energy systems? Scenarios in this aspect are a really unique way of being able to understand and identify what our numbers fail to capture. The only way that scenarios really work is with a team of partisan making, if you will. It gets very exciting to talk about energy, but it gets really difficult considering the polarization that often occurs within the subject. That being said, energy scenarios process is as much of a process about encouraging people to come together and find the middle ground as best as they can. The unique group of people that were part of the Team PA process, really I saw dynamically go through that process. People came in with very specific ideas of how they thought energy was unfolding, and we all quickly realized when you started talking to farmers, when you started talking to those in the blue-collar sector, when you started talking to academia, we all had very different ideas of how the future could unfold. But today that's what we're going to be discussing, especially with the experts who are going to lay out what that exact vision of Pennsylvania is for you. What I'm here to do today is just remind you of why it's important to understand the global context of what we're talking about. Although we're all deeply engaged in building up the local connectivity between energy systems, it's important to remember that the world we live in today actually is influenced by a multitude of factors. So even though here in Pennsylvania we know that we have an abundance of gas to work with, we know that we're historical leaders in nuclear, we know we have all these resources, unfortunately we still interact with a world that expands beyond borders. Something that's very exciting about Pennsylvania that I'm here to remind you, and I'm not sure if we do each and every day, is just the utter wealth of resources that we're sitting on here and the importance of having a really PA-focused plan as to what we do with those. For anyone who understood or was able to listen to Andrew Place's speech at the PEC Awards, I thought he captured the complexity of Pennsylvania systems absolutely incredibly. I'm going to skip forward to this. But what we also are working with to understand is how, as we develop in Pennsylvania, how does that interact with the global kind of understanding, the global markets, if you will. At a global level right now, there's as much of indecision about what happens with the future of the world as what we hear in between our own nations here. We know that the world going forward can kind of shift within two different scenarios, if we will. At the global level, we describe these in terms of music, in terms of how we see energy and economy interacting going forwards. The one scenario is called jazz, the other is called symphony. This is an important reminder throughout the scenarios process. These are not prescriptions, these are not policy recommendations, these are descriptions of how we see the future unfolding. At the global level, World Energy Council works with the IMF, the IEA, World Bank, the Paula Scher Institute, and Accenture to make sure that we are predicting the future in as dynamic of a way as possible. You can keep going, or? Okay. However, what we also know is that these scenarios tend to have very different impacts on how individual nations are kind of developed and how they go forward. So if we think in the world in terms of global energy and global trade, we do know that there right now are different impacts on GDP. For instance, let's look at the US within these charts. This is the newest hard rock scenario, which we don't even need to talk about today. But let's look at the previous GDPs for America alone. We see in the modern jazz scenario a 2% growth. We see in the unfinished symphony only 1% growth for America. So what causes these factors to influence, and what do we need to be talking about today, and keeping in mind that we're talking about the stories of Pennsylvania? What we see is that there's 7 truths to energy no matter how we look at them. There are 7 ways to really judge what's happening, or the 7 issues that we need to handle as we go about planning our energy in Pennsylvania. We have the opportunity to increase our economic development path in a very succinct way through energy, but we know that it has a deep impact on the environment. So within the 7 recommendations from the World Energy Council, we also know that this is what the global consensus is about for decision makers. And some of these things should really impact and frame how we hear the stories that Denise, Adam, and Andrew will talk about today. We know that the world's primary energy demand growth will peak before 2030. We know that the demand for electricity is doubling out to 2060. There's still a phenomenal rise of solar and wind energy, although that's certainly different for us locally in Pennsylvania. It includes a much more expansive, diverse set of resources, right? We know that the demand peak for coal and oil have the potential to take the world from stranded assets to stranded resources. We know that it's important to transition our transportation networks in the way that we use and consume fuel as much as we can. And we know it's utterly very important to make sure that we're limiting the impact of global warming to avoid the disastrous impacts of climate change. But most importantly, what everyone agrees on, no matter how you're seeing this future unfold and how you see the role of government in doing so, we know that global cooperation, sustainable economic growth, and technology innovation are the key to harnessing the power of energy on our economic development. So without further ado, I shall let these experts define the future scenarios and what they were able to collect from deep months of methodology and investigation with a plethora of Pennsylvanians. And also, I would like to say congratulations to Denise, who's also going to talk to us a little bit today about just how her position has come out to support energy in Pennsylvania. So it's exciting to be here, and thank you for having me involved in the process. Just hold it like this, like a little rose.
A little rose. Can you hear me?
Yeah.
Great. I'm so honored to be here today with a team of really great people who helped to pull this effort together. I'm just going to switch over presentation quickly. And I don't know how to do that. So we're calling this Pennsylvania Energy Horizons. This is our Pennsylvania take on what global scenarios are, but it's applied to Pennsylvania. We felt it was very important to make sure that you know that we are the first state ever to do this. It's been done in other countries, but it's never been done at the state level. It's not even been done in the United States. So this was a pretty significant effort to bring 35 people together to talk about what Pennsylvania could look like. I think Katrina set the global context for us, but I'm going to have you look at this photograph from a street corner in New York City in 1910. We're looking at all dominant modes of transportation in 1910. I'm going to come back to this slide in a little bit, but think about all of the changes that we've experienced in the last 100 years. The evolution of transportation, not just in New York City, but in the United States in general. We could use an anecdote around technology just as easily as we could use an anecdote around transportation. I'll share my personal one with you, that 25 years ago, when I was entering graduate school, my dad felt it was important that I had a briefcase form of a cell phone in my car that had a magnetic antenna attached to the roof, because that's safety. And today, I have 2 cell phones and an iPad. My child has a cell phone, and both of my children have iPads. And my car has an integrated technology system that's linked to my iPhone. So we've evolved in pretty significant and rapid ways. So just think about how we might look to the past as a guide for the future. And are we ready for that? We keep talking about 35 Pennsylvanians. What do we mean by that? We had 35 people across the Commonwealth with a wide variety of backgrounds, either directly or indirectly tied to the energy work that we were doing. So they either had tangential knowledge of energy or direct knowledge of energy. And they could be in the wind business or the solar business or the natural gas business or the pipeline business or some other business entirely different to all of that, energy efficiency. But they all came from different backgrounds and different places in the energy system. And we spent a year talking about what influences energy. We did it in a Chatham House Rules type of scenario where no particular comments were attributed to anybody. But we really wanted to have an open dialogue about how all of those influences on our energy system might actually change the composition of our energy system in the future. Our mission, as we defined it by the 35 participants who contributed to this effort, was to answer two really important questions. How might Pennsylvania's energy system evolve in the next 25 years, and what might that mean for Pennsylvanians? Can I just get a show of hands of how many of you think those are two critical questions? Good. That means you're with us. If you want to look 25 years ahead, it's important to understand Pennsylvania's own unique history and where we sit currently with energy, because that's led us to a culmination of where we are today and strategically points us in a direction of where we're going in the future. We call this our picture of now, and this is going to be my piece of the presentation, but it's the participants' common and collective understanding of what we are experiencing today and what the signs and signals are to calibrate the stories that Andrew and Adam will tell us. So let's look really closely at Pennsylvania as an energy leader. We have a long and storied history around energy, and it's important to reflect on how long and how deep Pennsylvania has had in the energy system. We like to throw in personal anecdotes throughout this presentation. I think it's important for you all to know, I'm the granddaughter of a coal miner who died of black lung. But his efforts pulled our family out of poverty and enabled my father and his brothers to not be coal miners, to be something different, to grow economically and socially. And those efforts helped me and my brother become first-generation college graduates in our family. So I share that with you at the start of this because we start with coal as a very fundamental baseline energy piece of our story that's important. It's provided heat and power to sustain decades of economic growth in Pennsylvania and really positioned our state to be a manufacturing powerhouse. So we have coal-fired power plants. We had coal driving the steel industry. We became a manufacturing base. But how many of you also know that Pennsylvania in 1859 put in the first commercial oil well in the United States? Didn't start in Texas, started here. Gave rise to Quaker State and Pennzoil and all those iconic Pennsylvania names that we all know about but maybe aren't thinking about on an everyday basis. I put a picture up for you. Kudos to PICO for providing this to us. It's a picture of the World's Fair, the Centennial World's Fair that was hosted in Pennsylvania in 1876. And they unveiled a Centennial steam engine that ran power to the main building for the World's Fair. What's important about that is that it represents sort of a modern electrical grid and was symbolizing the power of technology that was transforming the United States at that time into an industrial nation. And Philadelphia was showcasing that. In 1913, Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania was the home to the first gas station in the United States. In 1957, we had the first nuclear plant in the United States. It came online at Shippingport, and that was followed by additional plants through the 70s. In 2004, the first Marcellus shale well was drilled in Pennsylvania by Range Resources. It's called the Wren's Well. So I think it goes to say that we've had a really long history in being an energy leader, and that is reflective of our electric generation fleet. So we're very unique compared to other states. We have coal, we have natural gas, we have nuclear, and we have renewables feeding into our electricity generation in Pennsylvania. So much so that we are the #1 net exporter of electricity in the United States. So we produce more than we consume, and the balance of that goes out on the grid to feed economic development via electricity to other places. We talk about energy transitions globally in one way, but in Pennsylvania we actually have 2 energy transitions occurring right underneath our feet. So we divert a little bit and make sure that you understand the distinction, because we are having a natural gas revolution at the very same time that we are looking for ways to decarbonize. Our participants agreed, and this is important, our participants agreed, despite the range of inputs and opinions in the room, that Pennsylvania's place in the energy transition must be viewed through the lens of natural gas, which has helped begin our pathway towards lower greenhouse gas emissions, but we can't lose sight of the need to deepen our efforts towards decarbonization. This data that I'm showing you on the screen shows the disruptive force of natural gas, because the hockey stick inflection there is 10 years of our history. And that is the natural gas production that we were looking at while we were doing these energy scenarios. Prior to this inflection, the United States was building import facilities to bring natural gas in from abroad. We all agreed that the sheer volume of the resource brings a lot of complexity to the discussion of our energy future. And in some ways, if you reflect on what Katrina was talking about in terms of global energy transitions, what's happening in the global space, the globe is paying more attention to Pennsylvania than perhaps Pennsylvania is paying attention to itself. How do we contend with a resource of this magnitude and the desire for deep decarbonization? What led natural gas to become such a disruptive force? Did we see it coming? Could we have? And then there's how Pennsylvanians feel about their environment. It's so important. Pennsylvanians value our energy, but we have natural resources and an environment worth protecting, not just for us, but for future generations. And that was a critical part of all participants' viewpoint on Pennsylvania, was that the environment must be protected. And this is where the fun part comes in. Energy really can't be viewed from any single lens. There's additional forces that are shaping our energy system. And I'd like to walk through some of those with you. They don't really have anything to do with energy, but yet they push on the energy system in ways that we can see happening today. And these are the signs and signals and signposts that I want you to think about when we get to the Rivers and Roots story. They're environmental, they're cultural, they're political, and they're economic. But we have to look at each one and how it influences the picture of now so that we can calibrate that with the storylines that we present. Let's start with weather first. We grappled a lot with this in the sessions. Climate change, weather-related impacts. How do we describe this in a way that resonates with all of us, despite how we may agree or disagree with certain arguments around climate change? What can't be missed is the cost of weather events. So I just want to give you a couple statistics on where we are today and how that gets interwoven into the predictions for the future. If you look over the past 20 years, NOAA has really good data on the cost for dealing with flooding. So over 20 years in Pennsylvania, we spent, you average it out, $100 million a year to address infrastructure-related costs to deal with flooding. You can break that down even further to $9.3 million per month in infrastructure-related damage from weather in Pennsylvania. But what's more profound, perhaps, are the numbers that aren't on this slide, which I'm going to give you. In the current year ending June 30th, 2019, PennDOT spent $130 million on dealing with emergency projects associated with weather that cause damage to infrastructure. I want to know what you think they budget every year. $15 million. Is that sustainable? In 2005, PICO was kind enough to give us this data most recently. Their infrastructure damage costs over a 5-year average in 2005 was $22 million. In 2019, it's $67 million. So we felt that this data was important because you cannot dispute the numbers. And they're going up and they're trending in ways that will be problematic. We have a very diverse Pennsylvania landscape. I love talking about this because I'm kind of from small town Pennsylvania, and I've lived in big cities, and I've lived in small cities, and I've lived outside of Pennsylvania for small amounts of time. And we have this diversity of viewpoints in Pennsylvania that are reflective of what I'll call regional preferences and priorities. So I think you've seen this play out depending on where you live. We've got placemaking that occurs in cities and towns and boroughs, and it's urban, suburban, and rural. But the values we assign to energy often follow those regional preferences and priorities. So being in one part of Pennsylvania, you may have different attitudes and values assigned to energy than being in another part of Pennsylvania. And it gets equally compounded by the natural gas industry, who goes like this in Pennsylvania, and there's a whole part of it that's missing. So I think it's fun to watch and talk about. We've also had some pretty serious challenges to the structural parts of our economy. So much like the nation, we've had fundamental and profound shifts in how people are employed. So from 1975 to 2015, we've had a 17% decline in manufacturing and a 27% increase in service sector jobs as a percentage of employment. We don't have to dig any deeper than this. We're just shifting in the ways that we are employed. But do we know today what kind of jobs our children will need to prepare for in the next 25 years? Globalization is another factor that plays a serious role. We live in a highly interconnected and global society. How do we position Pennsylvania to deal with the challenges and avail ourselves to the opportunities in an increasingly interconnected world with areas of the globe that are emerging economies and need energy? We are divided politically. I know Ryan had something to say about this at the beginning of the presentation. No one can deny that we live in a polarized society. Nowhere is that more evident in our local, state, and national discourse. It makes doing anything on important issues really difficult. What are the consequences of our action or inaction in our political system? So to answer our organizing question, we prepared two very distinctly different stories about our future. And we relied on all of the lenses that I just walked through, whether it be our own energy transitions, the weather complications, what makes culturally uniquely PA, and our global and US forces pushing on Pennsylvania as we evolve into the next generation. Two really important things. The stories are called Rivers and Roots. They are iconically Pennsylvania. I just want you to think about how iconic those names are. We have the most rivers and streams of the lower 48, and we are deeply rooted in our communities. We joked in the sessions that we connect with people based on where we went to high school, not where we went to college, where we went to high school. So the picture of now is simply a guide rail. And finally, returning to this photo. I want to close with this, and then I'm going to turn it over to Andrew, who's going to tell you the river story. You can see all the dominant modes of transportation at the beginning of the century. If you are standing on this street corner, what does it look like in 10 years? I've given you a glimpse of at least one thing that happened. You had a gas station in Pittsburgh in 1913, and the federal highway system was born around this time. The framework for the way in which everything moves today started very shortly after this, and the Model T is at the clip of the photograph. So just leave you with that to think about. What's in the corner and obscured may be actually the most important thing that we're missing. Andrew, do you want to come up, talk about rivers? So many things.
Is this the television? This is the television one. I took the other one. Are you going to use it? All right. I did note that that's electric vehicle.
Oh, is it?
The trolley.
Oh.
It jumped out at me that, oh yeah, you got the 22nd century or 21st century in there as well. So that said, rivers, thank you very much, Denise. Yeah, rivers are certainly iconic, and hopefully it'll come across why we did this visualization of rivers versus roots. And originally they were jazz and blues, and we sort of came to the end of how well those constructs worked, and we settled on these rivers and roots idea. And I think certainly for Pennsylvania, it's evocative of what we are hoping to get across in these stories. And the stories is the important piece to make. And I should also note, in my introduction clearly, I'm a commissioner on the Public Utility Commission, but please suspend your reality at the moment. I'm speaking here as part of this work here, and not speaking as a commissioner on the commission. But these are stories about potential futures, and we could have settled on any number of them, n-dimensional views, but I think for what we were hoping to get across in evoking potential futures, 2 is perhaps the right number. But we begin the story, despite a prevailing sense of prosperity, there's a certain uneasiness below the surface, and I think that's clear. We've seen it for years, for those of us who've lived within the Commonwealth for many decades perhaps, but also in your daily news here. There is an undergirding of uneasiness among the population. Pennsylvanians are asking themselves in 2020, today, will this prosperity last? And am I sharing in the prosperity within the Commonwealth's borders? And again, I should back up just slightly, thinking about my world, and I think for the 35 of us who came together on this conversation, trying to bound an exercise within a geographic boundary is always a challenge, because so much of this seeps out, both importing and exporting across that boundary to our neighboring states, to the nation as a whole, to the hemisphere, to the globe, particularly when we're thinking about carbon and so on. It's very difficult to think just within the boundaries of the Commonwealth. But at the same time, I think Pennsylvania, the keystone state, the proverbial keystone state, has these boundaries that do work for us for this exercise. I think it's a microcosm, or it's a chunk that does really capture the dimensions, all the dimensions of this exercise. But the second question I think Pennsylvanians are often asking themselves, are we actively shaping society in a manner that best reflects our values and ambitions? I think that's sort of a critical issue, that whether it's a kitchen table question around our families or within our communities or within the Commonwealth as a whole, these are fundamentally important questions that are always in the back of many folks' minds. Structurally, the question is, and this comes probably to none of us as a surprise, political gridlock and structural misalignment leave the state vulnerable to crises. If you look, I've lived in the Commonwealth since 1989. I think in 1989 I came in thinking that yes, we have structural challenges here, misalignment that can leave us and have been over time led us from one crisis to another. But that's very much what we saw in this scenario as well. That's the opening round, that we're living in a world, we're living within a commonwealth of political gridlock and challenge. Then something happens. In this scenario, a crisis erupts. Whether it's the opioid crisis, whether it's an economic downturn, whether it's an ecological incident, whether it's that you are concerned for our children's future, whether it's a structural financial challenge within the Commonwealth's government. These are any one of these, and we didn't want to bucket and sort of say, okay, this is the crisis that sets it off. The idea is this is a story. There is a crisis that's an underpinning of this thought is that, okay, a crisis occurs. It's not really relevant, important what that crisis is, that a crisis happens. Regardless of whether that's, regardless of what the crisis is, there's a dramatic shift at that moment in our politics. There's a shift towards the center. We get away, this is the moment, this is sort of the predicate that gets us away from the sense of polarization and it's my way or your way, or no ability to negotiate or compromise over the public good. And to that point, energy emerges as one of the multitude of issues that are dealt with. So again, we go from a pre-crisis moment where, in this case, energy is a very divisive issue, to saying, look, we see the importance of finding common ground on these issues. Pennsylvania develops a statewide strategy around energy that recognizes the inherent value of natural gas resources and the desire to decarbonize. A hallmark of the strategy includes significant state investment in technology and the innovation sector. And we begin doing a much better job of bridging the gap between primary research and commercialization. Ultimately, we see this platform to begin driving the energy systems in new directions. Efforts to decarbonize are driven mainly by increased costs borne by erratic weather events. And again, this is where you start to think about the interaction of global versus state, the disappearance of some of these boundaries. But for this exercise, think about that the contemplation in folks' minds is the increasing costs of not addressing climate issues. The effects are manifested through PJM-wide, a regional grid-wide carbon trading program. So again, a significant shift from where we are today, and taking the regional grid, the 13 states and the District of Columbia that are in the PJM grid, very much again, Pennsylvania is the cornerstone of that, and impose a carbon price. The carbon trading program helps to encourage the deployment of renewables in the power sector and leads to the stability of the Commonwealth's nuclear generators. The emphasis on technology and innovation during the 2020s is directly tied to Pennsylvania emerging as a major player in this fourth phase of industrialization. Of course, Pennsylvania has always played a significant role in each of the preceding three phases. First, heat, steam, and power, move machines. Second, electrification, electric motors, and assembly line production phase methods. Third, digitization, automation, remote control. The fourth industrial interlude is, of course, driven by very much sitting here at Carnegie Mellon, thinking about cyber and IT, et cetera, predictive analytics, AI. So the wise and patient investments of the 2020s have paid off. Now we're moving into the 2030s, and Pennsylvania is prepared to innovate and compete globally. However, the climate disruptive issues still associated with costs still are a concern for the Commonwealth's businesses and residents. The call to action increase around climate mitigation measures intensifies. Carbon capture and sequestration becomes the central cornerstone of the issues around how we resolve and mitigate the concerns about climate. The technology advances of the 2020s, plus the outcome of PJM-wide carbon trading program, plus recognition globally that CCS, well, storage utilization, is to be critical element of driving down emissions, equal the willingness to invest in CCUS, and the beginnings of significant deployment in the power and industrial sectors. The regional grid also begins to change in fundamental ways. Power utilities evolve and transform. New business models embrace sustainability and efficiency. Coal is essentially drawn down, left behind, largely marginalized. Natural gas is helping to support significant renewable deployment. Vehicle electrification finally takes hold in a meaningful way. Increasingly, energy efficiency gains are made in the residential, commercial, transportation sectors. Even with coal as a fraction of its former self, the power sector remains diverse and is helping to meet emissions targets. However, the benefits of the burgeoning river's future are not equally distributed, and this is a critical point. Prosperity tends to adhere to large or specialized cities geared up for this global digital economy. I sort of split my time between the city of Pittsburgh and a farm an hour south of here. So very much I see both of these worlds, the challenges we are seeing, have seen, or continue to see, and will see throughout this scenario. But urban revival is leaving some rural communities behind. Income inequality widens in many, mainly rural areas, as the economy focuses its wealth and resources on becoming a globally competitive player. This proves to be a persistent problem, unfortunately one that is left for the next generation of Pennsylvanians to find solutions to. So 2040, the river scenario in 2040. Pennsylvania is cosmopolitan, energy-rich, and energy-diverse, addressing greenhouse gas emissions, but the best opportunities fail to escape the gravitational pull of urban areas. Question for the future generations, I noted. How does Pennsylvania balance growth with collective well-being? We did modeling, somewhat rudimentary input-output modeling on the scenarios to get an idea, flavor for what the economy and what the energy space would look like on these two different scenarios. Briefly, looking here, the increase is significant if you think about, and Adam's going to do the root scenario, but thinking about the comparison between rivers and roots, significant in-migration in the river scenario, 25% greater households than there are in 2015. Industrial GDP rises from $275 billion to $495 billion over that time horizon in nominal dollars. Industrial demand is up primarily related to strong sector growth initiated by Industry 4.0. Technology and innovation surges energy efficiency measures and drives down demand despite the increase in the number of households. Transportation fuel demand is reduced by conversion to electric vehicles, and overall efficiency gains are moving from internal combustion to electric vehicles. Despite all this, primary energy consumption in the Commonwealth is down by 5%. In-state consumption of coal, as noted, is dramatically lower, 85% below where it was in 2015. Natural gas production is up 16%. Oil is down 61%, consumption again. And then the natural gas, 30% is increased consumption in the Commonwealth, and 11% is exported, in this case in molecular form. We separated out export by wire. As you noted here, the electric generation is largely unchanged from 2015 to 2040. Very small delta in the quadrillion BTUs consumed. Again, as I noted, coal's down, natural gas is up substantially for electricity generation. Renewables, although you're starting at a very low point, is up by 265%, and nuclear remains stable in this scenario. And finally, the primary drivers, you see a substantial reduction in CO2 emissions in the power sector, primarily driven by the decline in coal, increase in natural gas consumed and renewables, as well as a stable nuclear consumption generation, and carbon capture and storage becoming a significant player in bringing down those numbers, and the robust move from internal combustion to electrification in the transport sector. So synopsis, in this scenario, in the river scenario, you see political gridlock broken, energy strategy implemented, decarbonization prioritized, industrial growth materialized, and urban revival realized, all with the caveats and intricacies I've spoken to over the last 10 minutes or so. And with that, I will pass it to Adam to bookend the second scenario we considered.
Okay, so now I'm going to ask everyone in the audience to sort of hit the reset button. And we're going to go back to where we ended with our picture of now and where we began with our river scenario. And we're going to tell a very different story. And in this story, well, we call this story Roots. And I want to point out that with this story, it's a very different social, political, and economic landscape that pushes Pennsylvania and Pennsylvania's energy system in a distinctly different direction. But I want to make everybody aware of the fact that we do not, as the individuals that help to create these scenarios, see them as mutually exclusive. Okay, and our actual, our actual future history, if we can describe a scenario as a hypothetical future history, will look very much, like parts and parcels of either one. So, let's begin. We begin the same place we did with our river scenario, which is that Pennsylvania is a great place to live. But unlike the simmering unrest, below the surface that percolates up, a crisis develops, it shatters political gridlock, things move to the center. In our root scenario, Pennsylvanians are focused less on that type of competitiveness building and urban revival, and more on local civic engagement and creative problem solving. And ultimately, Roots is a story of localism. And it explores the inherent strengths as well as the inherent limitations of such an approach, a local approach, to Pennsylvania's enormous and vastly complex energy system. So in Roots, So in Roots, political gridlock persists, and it moves forward in more of a business-as-usual manner, and as a result, there is no statewide approach to energy. And throughout the 2020s, the development of Pennsylvania's natural gas is curtailed due to the vocal and increasingly successful local opposition to pipeline development, and projects that were planned are put on hold, and many are ultimately canceled, and these are mainly interstate transmission pipelines that do not materialize. But the availability of natural gas, of course, persists, and the gas needs to go somewhere. And we say that it blindly chases the market, and what we mean by that is that it blindly chases the market. It takes a path of least resistance, and this leads to some unintended consequences. One of those consequences is that it's very easy for Pennsylvania's natural gas, and I think we're seeing a lot of this today, be transported to newly built power plants, where ultimately it's used to generate electricity and eventually exported many times to other states and other areas of the country by wire. Another consequence is that the abundance of inexpensive natural gas is used to generate electricity, and this accelerates coal's decline, although not as quickly in rivers as we'll see in the modeling results at the end of this scenario. And it also undermines the viability of zero emissions nuclear energy. And our laissez-faire reliance on abundant natural gas creates little incentive for the type of industrial growth and positioning Pennsylvania as an industrial player moving in to the future. So another salient element of the root scenario is that the economy drifts a little bit. And it's not to say that we're in the throes of recession throughout the 2020s and throughout the 2030s, but we're not seeing the industrial growth and sort of the booming economy that we do in the river scenario. And as a result, promises of public sector infrastructure spending do not materialize. Companies, private organizations typically begin to hedge against risk rather than thinking more entrepreneurially or more forward thinking in their investment approach. And as a result, state government becomes a little bit less reliable, so we should say. And local initiatives begin. I said at the outset that this is a story of localism, and in the 2020s in Roots, local initiatives begin to emerge that fill the void that really is left by a less proactive state government. And these are communities that are seeking to do any number of things in regards to service delivery and providing things that their communities and that their constituents and residents need. And so there's a variety of issues that they're looking at, but of course one of those issues, because this is ultimately a story of Pennsylvania's energy system, is that they're looking into new ways to generate and distribute energy. And as a result, local success increasingly is dependent on good governance, on a strong civic sector, and the most creative of these leaders are successfully promoting and developing distributed generation systems, particularly in regards to solar projects, and they're beginning to use energy, again, in the absence of a proactive state government, in the absence of a state energy policy. Communities are beginning to use energy as a form of placemaking, and it's a way to attract businesses to their place. So around this time, again, we're still in the 2020s, powerful weather events hammered the United States, including Pennsylvania, and we suggested that these could be hurricanes, tornadoes, floods, something of a continuation of I think, what we're already seeing nationally, but is impacting our state pretty profoundly. And of course, the cost to recover from these multiple and unrelenting weather events continues to rise. Widespread emergency response operations, disaster-related property damage puts more and more of a strain on the federal government's ability to address these. Mainly, they need revenue. So the other thing that's happening in this part of the 2020s Roots is that the link between weather events and climate change is ultimately still being debated by some. But there's this overwhelming consensus that these pressing catastrophic issues must be addressed in some way. And these concerns are heightened to the national level. And what we get is sort of a marriage of convenience between a federal government, not as rosy of a macroeconomic picture, but we have a federal government that's starved of revenue and needs a way to address these issues from a funding perspective. And we also have the coalescing of that with environmental policy as a way to address this issue. And as a result, in our Roots scenario, by the close of the 2020s, we have a national price on carbon. So now nationally, it costs for people to emit greenhouse gas emissions, particularly in the power and the industrial sectors. And this action provides some fiscal relief, as I mentioned, for the feds to help put dollars into states and communities for disaster cleanup, and it ultimately makes renewables a bit more cost competitive, I should say. So as the 2020s come to a close, we still have persistent gridlock, we still have protracted state budget issues, and this has yielded a less reliable state as well as national government. However, local and regional success abounds where good governance prevails, I love that line, and communities tapping into local alliances and regional collaboration are able to capitalize on the entrepreneurial spirit that does not go away in this Roots scenario, and small businesses continue to flourish in areas where they're able to sort of find their way in this new economic reality. But of course, the success is patchwork in nature, and other communities are witnessing their younger residents leaving for opportunities beyond Pennsylvania's borders. So emerging into the 2030s now, as we enter the 2030s, there is a renewed interest in farming, in agricultural production. And regional efforts are initiated on small farms, especially near upscale population centers. It's still in vogue to buy local. So Pennsylvania is uniquely positioned between cities in Ohio, Pittsburgh, Baltimore, DC, Philadelphia, New York City, I could go on. And these are areas that are generating a good bit of demand for Pennsylvania's locally grown, sustainably sourced agricultural products. So there's that driving this renewed interest in agriculture in Pennsylvania into the 2030s in a Roots scenario. The other thing that's happening that agriculture emerges as one of the more salient aspects of Pennsylvania's economy in a root scenario. And of course, it always has been a foundational element of Pennsylvania's economy, and we can have a debate on how important it is, but ultimately agriculture, or how large it is, but ultimately agriculture touches many different aspects of Pennsylvania's economy. But another thing that's helping to drive this newfound, the value of our native soil, as it says on the slides, is that while Pennsylvania's experience with erratic weather, as I mentioned earlier, is mainly floods and storms, we're getting more water, other areas of the nation and of the globe are receiving less, and they're dealing with droughts. So there begins this sort of small yet still fundamental shift of global production of agricultural commodities. Pennsylvania is uniquely positioned to tap into that and to provide products, commodities that the world needs. And because of this strong focus on agriculture and a strong focus on land, there are many more efforts throughout the 2030s to protect and restore open spaces. So one of the questions that I received recently was that, well, don't floods wash out agricultural crops? Sometimes they can, but there are unique approaches to dealing with that and mitigating against those issues, and agriculture is able to emerge as a slightly more dominant aspect or element of Pennsylvania's economy. So in both scenarios, erratic weather continues to hammer Pennsylvania, and this is not unlike anything that's happening in either scenario at the national or the global level. And building on the distributed generation, the solar projects that I mentioned in the 2020s, there's a new type of municipal improvement district that emerges, and this is not unlike something that we see nationally. We see it all over the state. I think there are probably more than a dozen in the city of Pittsburgh, and that's the business improvement district model. And we can talk about what that looks like exactly afterwards if you'd like. But revenue that's generated from this model is able to be put into energy projects, energy development projects, and it's able to meet the needs of communities seeking assurances in the face of a less reliant and increasingly less resilient sort of centralized transmission system or grid. And they're also seeking a cleaner, more reliable energy system that facilitates opportunities for business attraction. In a word, placemaking, as I mentioned earlier. So for many in the 2030s, Pennsylvania remains a good place to live. It's a great place to live, but success and the lack thereof is relatively unevenly distributed throughout the state. Some communities have been able to tap into their strong civic sector, good governance, and dynamic local leadership to maintain service delivery, to increase their agricultural output, and they've been able to use energy in many cases to reduce their local carbon footprint, to shore up power resiliency, and to attract businesses in new and innovative ways. Others, unfortunately, have been unable to thrive in this increasingly disjointed macroeconomic picture, and many have witnessed population loss as this generation that has occurred over the last 20 or so years is beginning to leave the state in many cases for opportunities elsewhere. And as we close the root scenario, by 2040, the mid-century generation of Pennsylvanians that remain, I should say, have turned 20 years of frustration with ineffective state government into a quiet pride in the communities that they've created. They feel good about their communities, and they are relatively comfortable with their lifestyles. This is particularly true given the absence of state and federal leadership, and communities that have been successful can, with a straight face, say that this is our success, right? I mean, we dug in to our roots, and we made it work, and we've done well. So our state collectively is more than ever a world of relationships, local pride, and self-reliance. In short, social capital comes to supersede, in many cases, financial capital. But this acceptance of simple, back-to-earth civic virtues poses longer-term problems and challenges for the next generation of Pennsylvanians. And one of the questions that's being posed by this generation in a 2040 root scenario is, what do we want for our future? Do we represent a new wave of restless ambition that's going to remain and shake things up and shape Pennsylvania and our communities in a way that aligns with our values? Or do we leave for opportunities elsewhere, as many have done over the course of the last 20 years? So that's the story, and now we can get into the fun part. I guess that was fun too, but I really like the data particularly. So these the subsequent 5 slides are going to mirror the 5 that Andrew displayed for the river scenario. Of course, the modeling outputs are very different, and all of the salient elements, social, political, economic things that drove us to these different outputs are what was just described in each scenario. So from a macroeconomic picture, there's a decrease in households, mainly as a result of people moving out of the state, and less of a focus on urban regeneration and urban revitalization. And industrial GDP does increase, begins at about $275 billion, and we end at $350 billion, which is a $75 billion uptick in industrial GDP. Looking at per sector demand for energy, in the root scenario, it is essentially down across the board. The numbers, of course, are up there for you to view and to cogitate. Industrial demand is down mainly due to slower economic growth, and rather than having our gas be pumped into, pun intended, but be pushed into the industrial sectors, as we saw in rivers, a lot of it is going into the power sector, and it's being exported by wire. In many cases, not for consumption by Pennsylvanians. A sluggish economy drives residential and commercial demand down, and transportation demand for energy within the transportation sector is down 6%. That's less of a result of the major efficiency gains that come with vehicle electrification and more of just the fact that fewer households, fewer cars. From a total primary energy perspective, primary energy is down 35% in Pennsylvania. The in-state consumption of coal is down 67%. Oil down 33%, both dramatic declines, but not as profound as what we saw in the river scenario. Natural gas as a result of projects being put on hold, drilling being curtailed because there's no way to get the gas out in a root scenario. Natural gas production is down 35%. And then the 56 and the 69% numbers below natural gas are important for the next slide. So from 2015 to 2040, there's a 56% increase in natural gas that's being used in the state of Pennsylvania. And of course, there's a 69% decrease. But as we'll see, I believe on the next slide, that almost all of that natural gas that's being, so the delta between 2015 and 2040, the 56% increase of gas that's being used in state is almost exclusively being driven into the power sector as natural gas increases 231% as from 2015 to 2040 as the amount that's being of electricity that's generated. I should note that this is produced electricity. This is a nameplate capacity. So this is actual electrical output from Pennsylvania's generation fleet. Coal is down 66%. Again, not as profound in the river scenario. Renewables is up 215%. If you look at it as a function of the whole pie, it ends up being about 12% of power generation. I should also note that this is just the power sector. So there is a lot of renewables growth that occurs in this scenario that is not captured with this chart because, as I mentioned, distributed generation, energy improvement districts are counted outside of the power sector in this particular model. And of course, there is no grand bargain for the nuclear industry. We're down 35% of electricity generated from nuclear power, and that's the equivalent of about 3 Pennsylvania reactors, and I won't surmise on which 3 of those could be. But generally speaking, the production of electricity in Pennsylvania is huge in this scenario because of where the natural gas ends up. A 0.3435 quadrillion BTU increase is quite substantial from 2015 to 2040. And then, of course, the CO2 picture is also not as robust of a decline as we saw in the river scenario. And again, the primary drivers of this is that our power gen fleet is more carbon intensive rather than less. There is no carbon capture, utilization, and storage in this scenario, or at least not beyond any noteworthy pilot projects. Vehicle electrification is much more moderated. Reduced demand from fewer homes, slower commercial industrial growth is ultimately what is driving this decrease in CO2. So it's not about tapping into tech and innovation, next generation industrial production, CCUS, it's we're using less energy, and as a result, we're emitting less greenhouse gases. So just to summarize, political gridlock persists. In the root scenario, local entrepreneurial spirit defines the generation. Localism is the word that we used a lot throughout these workshops. Economic growth is relatively flat. Natural gas is exported primarily as an electron rather than in its molecular form. Localized energy self-sufficiency is what drives action around climate, and that's sort of helped by the national price on polluting, on emitting CO2. And just to kind of recap, this is a quote from Peter Schwartz that we liked. I think we used it at the outset of the of our workshops. Peter Schwartz is a think tank guy. He's a noted futurist. He wrote a number of books, published a number of papers. The role of scenarios is to arrange the factors so they illuminate the decision instead of obscuring it. One of the terms that we use throughout this project is strategic foresight. And I think that this is the type of quote that captures that well. You know, what are the things we're missing? I mean, you go back to the image of New York City in 1910. All the dominant modes of transportation are there. If you were a transportation planner, would you have missed the automobile becoming the dominant mode of transportation? If you did, I think you could have been forgiven if you were standing on that street corner. But ultimately, that is what happened. And how did we get there? We have the advantage, if you will, of hindsight. When we look at Pennsylvania's energy system moving forward, of course we don't. So we need to really have a robust, comprehensive discussion of where we're going, what's going to get us there, where we want to go, and that ultimately is what we hope to accomplish with this project. And with that, I will encourage everyone to go to PennsylvaniaEnergyHorizons.org. It's a wonderful website, and if there are any questions or points of discussion that anyone would like to pass, anybody wants to go down?
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
So I'm certain that there are a lot of questions. So I think, is it working? Yeah, so this particular microphone isn't working for the camera. So we'd love to have questions, and so if you would, I'm going to hand this to you so you can talk into it. Here, I'm going to hand this to you for you to hand that part. Okay.
I'll just have this, I guess. Hi, thank you so much for your presentation and for addressing us today. I'm Rachel Chambers. I'm a Master's of Science in Public Policy Management student currently at the Heinz College, which is just down the road. And of course, policy and planning are things that we are very concerned with, very interested in. And so kind of as I was listening to the rivers and root scenarios and as I read through the document before coming to this event, there are a couple things that are consistent, regardless of sort of what path and what externalities Pennsylvania faces. And so I guess I was kind of wondering, in your exercise as you were going through this, in what ways did you seek or are you seeking to mitigate sort of the extreme challenges, the social dislocation as a result of various economic processes or energy sort of approaches, or in what ways are you seeing climate and resilience mitigation? And I was just wondering if you were looking at that now moving forward, and in what ways that was going to be plans for Pennsylvania.
Me?
I'm curious to see what your take on that.
Yeah. I mean, I think it's a great question. Thanks for reading it ahead of time. Good job.
Yeah.
In terms of what we're doing, I think the last quote that Adam put up there is really resonant to that point as well, right? You know, the goal is not necessarily to prescribe, but help rather illuminate and make sure we're aware. So step one certainly are events like these, and we consider you policymakers too. Citizens are policymakers, right? So I think going out and having those conversations and dialogues are critically important. And we've had an all-above strategy in terms of who we want to talk to, where we want to go, and how we want to talk about it. So I think that's step one, just socializing the data and information that we have to make people aware. And I think as you dig deeper in this and as you dig deeper in the numbers, because what you saw here isn't the depth and breadth of all the data that we have and that Adam can work and manipulate to try to get a better idea of what we're doing. We'll have those more specific targeted conversations where appropriate and where it can make sense, right? So you want to have those conversations regarding rural economic development and the challenges therein with those people that can make those impact and really show them. That resonated most with me, in terms of either scenario. I come from a rural part of the Pennsylvania, and no matter if you look at both scenarios, rural PA struggles, at different varying levels, and they both, again, in Pennsylvania, I think fiber is running through them in terms of what it means. So I think at least in that, it caused me in our work and what we're doing to go back to the table, talk to the governor's office and others on more targeted, specific rural economic development work. Some people think a good economic development strategy is the same no matter where you're at. And I think we have to come to understand that no matter what path we take, we have to pay special attention to that basis solely on the data. So from the energy specific side, I'll hand it to the Executive Director of the Governor's Energy Office.
I agree that those are great questions, and one of the things that we reflected on in this process, and that I think is important to mention while all of you are here, is that this is not a policy exercise in and of itself, and that we weren't trying to define policy, but we were trying to create a tool for policymakers. One of the things that government does, regardless of where you're working in government, at the local level, the state level, the national level, is we tend to work within our individual boxes. And this exercise was intended to show all the different levers that can be pulled and how there's a domino effect on things we never think about. So the very things that you're raising as critical parts of the discussion are why we're taking these stories on the road, is because when you're trying to change a system to address an issue as complex as climate, there's the economic, societal, political piece that has to be addressed as part of that. So I guess to answer your question, we're going to think about that, and we're going to be talking about those things when we get to a point where we have a table that's big enough to accommodate the different topics that need to be included as part of a longer-term energy strategy.
Add one thing to that. One thing we didn't talk a lot about in the beginning is how we got the individuals to come to the table to do this work, because that's critically important. And it's different than anything I've at least participated in throughout my time at Pennsylvania and my background in economic development. Typically in Harrisburg, when we do these activities and exercises, you put up on the board, let's get this association, this nonprofit, and all these individuals here. That's not what we did when we did this process. We thought whose individual perspectives and viewpoints are critically important to add into this soup that we're putting together. And the individual perspective was of value. So we had a county commissioner who was a dairy farmer. So we had a rural Pennsylvanian who had challenges in the ag industry but was an elected official. So we didn't say, hey, CCAP, give us someone. And they were associations do great work in Harrisburg, and they're critically important to the process. But in this instance, I think we found, again, it was easier to get to a agreement, and although we talked about some areas we couldn't, when we broke down some of those barriers. And I think we had those conversations. I had a chance to address a trade association recently about this, and I think there was a feeling in the room, at some point we have to get yes to something. So what does that look like? And this helped illuminate that path for them.
Another way to address the question, and every time we've given this presentation, thus far, there's always been this tendency for folks to ask about really specific things and how we focused on things that in some cases are unique to the work that they do. And this is going to seem like a cop-out, and I assure you it's not. I'm glad that my colleagues answered it as well as they did, but this is one of the things that we want to be able to use this tool for, and that is sort of posing questions about really specific things that weren't included in the narratives back to the audience and saying, well, let's take healthcare or education, for example. We couldn't include everything in these scenarios, and we did not include any mention of healthcare and education. And if people, and this has come up, well, what does education look like? What does healthcare look like in rivers and then alternately in roots? And the question really is, how would you answer that, right? What do those things look like based on the salient elements of each scenario, and how you could see either your organization at the micro level, your industry, or anything bigger than that playing out given what unfolds in each scenario. So I said it was a cop-out because I would just throw a question back to the audience, but I really do think that that's one of the things that we want to begin using this tool for. So thank you.
Another question. Yes. We have a train that comes by, and
That's commerce, that's good.
it's usually carrying fuel.
Which leads to my question, actually. I noticed that there was a focus on export of natural gas via the lines, but not as much export globally of the actual commodity. And just wanted to know if that was an intentional or what that implies. Thanks.
If we missed that part, it was part of the river story.
Oh,
sorry. Yeah, it's global, and how high. So if we didn't explain that well enough, apologies. But it is vested in the river story because in rivers versus routes, there's a difference between infrastructure build out. In rivers, we have more ability to do pipeline infrastructure build out, and that enables the exportation of molecular natural gas. In routes, that infrastructure build out is interrupted by protests or by people not wanting the pipelines in their backyards, and so as a result, natural gas finds its way to the market. So it is there. It's in the rivers piece of it. Yeah.
I think too, something that I probably left out of the introduction that I was giving to is a lot of the impetus for even beginning this piece of work was asking that question, considering the fact that Pennsylvania is such a critical player now in the global forum. But in the global forum, everything is looked at with the possibility of nation states are able to do and enact. This entire exercise was caused by that question. What does it look like for Pennsylvania to begin to more strongly engage via energy on a global level? Whenever we're talking about specifically the demand for gas today, we know that it extends well beyond our borders. And when we're talking about struggles with equity and how much that relates to energy production, this is a global problem, but we all know, or we're quite certain of at least, that Pennsylvania might be a place to begin to figure this out. This is the same problem that people are struggling with all over the place, trying to understand what's the best for the consumer, how do we keep prices down, how do we do this cleanly, but how do we increase our connectivity to the global marketplace. So the exercise of what we go through and how we were going to do that specifically looked to answer that question. And so as Denise described it, that was a critical finding, I think, of the work itself.
Other questions?
I saw something in the last presentation, I think where it saw, Adam, natural gas transported by wire. Did I read that correctly? And if I did, what does that mean?
Keep you running.
Yeah, please restate the question.
Sure. So the question was there something in the last couple of slides where natural gas was transported by wire? The wording on the slide, I believe, is that natural gas is exported by wire, and there is a gap between how the statement is contrived and then what we're actually saying. What we're suggesting is that natural gas, predominantly Pennsylvanian domestic gas, is sent to the power sector and used as a fuel or a feedstock for power generation. And then the delta increase, what did I say? It's like a 0.34, 0.35 quadrillion BTU increase between 2015 and 2040 in the root scenario, and how much electricity is being produced in Pennsylvania. Consumption remaining relatively flat, that increase is almost to the BTU leaving the state through either via the capacity market, the PJM, or the ancillary markets, which would be New York State, for example, or really it could end up, those electrons could end up anywhere in the nation that they can find a highway to cruise on and stuff.
All the way in the back. So Alyssa, just hold your question until she gets there.
Hello everyone, my name is Alyssa Berger and I work at Carnegie Mellon, and I want to thank the panelists for this presentation and for everyone to sit through it. I think it was really informative and I know a lot of work went into it. I have two main questions and then some background, so if you bear with me, I apologize for the lengthy remarks. I think my two questions are, why is DCED leading the conversation on Pennsylvania's energy future and not DEP, who is statutorily required to write and update the state's climate action plans? And then my second question is a little more nuanced. You know, we talk about positioning Pennsylvania in terms of the challenges and opportunities around energy, and admittedly it is very complex and this wasn't a policy exercise, but it nonetheless will dictate what happens in the state. I noted, Denise, you're part of the new energy office as part of Governor Wolf's office. And so I guess I'm wondering, you know, how are we balancing different priorities when we talk about economic development as well as climate resiliency? So pausing there, just some background. I'm a 5th or 6th generation Pennsylvanian. My family has also worked in coal as well as steel, and I'm very proud of that. But that was then and not now, and I think there's a quote, when you know better, do better. And so, you know, for me, what's absent from this conversation is decarbonization. The UNFCCC report last year made very clear we have about 12 more years to really do something around emissions. And I think it's really on the governor's office and state agencies to make sure we're doing our part as a large energy exporter to decarbonize. And so, you know, just on future presentations, I think it's important to talk about the state's 2018 Climate Action Plan, 2018 Solar Plan, 2018 EV charging infrastructure plan, and that DEP has been very clear. The governor wants us to reduce emissions. We don't know how we're going to get to the 80 by 50 reductions. And so I think when we talk about things about economic development, not to conflate economic development strategy with what also has to happen. People don't want to wear seatbelts, but we have a law that says you have to wear your seatbelt. And so if this group can just really talk to us about what that means, because I suppose I don't entirely buy into the idea that if we're not producing natural gas and not exporting it domestically or overseas, that we're missing an economic development opportunity altogether. If states like Connecticut, Virginia, New York, Illinois can decarbonize and also see their GDP grow, I think Pennsylvania is capable of doing that as well. And I appreciate you letting me say all of that.
We're just discussing how we're going to break all that up.
Okay.
In response. So I'll start with at least the Governor's Office of Energy. I think your question was why is DCED taking the lead and not DEP? So I'm going to sort of rephrase this and maybe not give you a direct answer on which agency should take the lead. It's actually the Commonwealth is taking the lead, and that the issues around energy and climate affect more than just DCED and DEP. They are actually, you know, spread over the responsibilities of 10 to 12 other agencies in addition to that. And so the Governor's Office of Energy is establishing a Commonwealth Energy Collaborative where all those agencies, including the PUC, will sit at the table and start to cross-connect all of the different things that we're working on and how they relate to the end goals of what we're all trying to get to. So I hope that effectively answers your question in that it's not an either or, it's everyone at the table together. That's how we move it forward and bring all of the resources that the Commonwealth has to bear to solve really important problems that have a multitude of viewpoints and initiatives assigned to them.
I'll jump in. Now I'm good. I got more trees at my feet than I need. No, and the point was, it was an exercise in expert solicitation. elicitation on what people thought were plausible futures. It wasn't an exercise in what we wish or hope or require or insist upon being, but it was not a value judgment on where we should be. It was you looked at 37 or 35 diverse people around the room from this huge swath of diversity around the Commonwealth and said, all right, in 2030, what do you expect? What's a possible future? And if the question was put out there, do we see a move to 100% renewables? The consensus in the group was no. From our perspective, we don't think that's likely. But that was why we came up with these solutions as not solutions, but scenarios as stories. Thank you, as what we thought were plausible outcomes. And so that's where we need to be careful here. It would be a very different exercise if we went in and said, from a normative perspective, what would we like to see? What would you think is important to see or essential to see? That's an entirely different exercise than what we went through. Was what we think is, from our experience, is likely or possible future way forward. So that's the really distinction on the scenarios piece. And that's what this was. And in some ways it was irrelevant. DCD, it was Team PA, but that was only the convening body. It was the room we would sit in. The exercise was the 35 individuals from across the Commonwealth that came together, and there was representation from DEP as well. It was the essence of the intellectual heft that was in the room. The convener, the room we were sitting in, was tangential to the exercise. So.
And keeping in line with my job and part of this process is to add a bit of the extra nerdiness behind it. But I think, the question that you brought up, which is, if Massachusetts could do it, if Connecticut could do it, da-da-da. Again, looking at places around the world, the issue of decarbonization is absolutely fundamentally important. But when we talk about true sustainability, it's not just environmental impact. It's also the affordability for its citizens. It's also the accessibility of its citizens, of making sure that the average citizen is also able to have the supplies that they need to power their homes if you need to. So whenever we talk about what Pennsylvania needs to do, just topographically and geographically, we're dramatically different from the availability of resources that those other states have. When one wants to commence making a holistic energy policy, they normally begin with the scenarios process. As someone who sat in on now, this is my 14th scenario exercise in relation to energy. The exact process helps people to begin to dig into those questions. There's uniform agreement between 192 countries, including us right now, that actually the best thing to do for energy policy is to bring it down to a more state and regional level and identify how states and regions can fill in the gap in the 2-degree mark that we need to hit to prevent that disastrous scenario from happening. So it's absolutely fundamentally important that Pennsylvania figures out what to do. But this is the mechanism for beginning to do so, to beginning to identify that conversation, for beginning to understand how we can create affordable and sustainable energy supplies, but ensure that it benefits all of Pennsylvanians. That was really the goal of the exercise.
Lots more questions now. How about, let's do Marty and then the gentleman behind. Sharon, we'll get to you as well. I saw you in the back as well, sir. Yeah. Okay.
Marty Altschul, University Engineer Emeritus at CMU. Like emeritus, that means I used to be the university mechanical, but I deal in the electric circuit, the electric industry pretty intensely. I guess my question is, these two stories, are they robust enough that they could in fact be tweaked to take a look at inputs such as a determination by all the citizens to decarbonize or whatever else? Are they formulated in that way, or are they stories that are sort of standalone and are, anything would break the model?
Who'd like to start? Sorry, we're figuring out the technical response, actually. Okay. Okay.
Katrina can take it. And I'll follow up if you.
Okay. So, I know, sorry, I get really excited when people talk about quants and things behind models. So we don't want to do that right now, though. What we do want to do is answer that question succinctly. So just for your knowledge, it is, as we said, it's mainly based on kind of the basic fundamentals of a standard input-output model that's used for forecasting. In that aspect, you identify drivers for change, right? Inflation, 2%, that's what the causation. There are different societal drivers identified within the model itself that could be reneged to say, okay, yeah, we see this is going higher or not. But if not, the most exciting thing about being part of energy discussions like this, and especially one who comes to CMU often, is the capabilities to take that model and then to work alongside people with deeper expertise in adapting it and making it more robust. The most exciting part of this process for me as an academic, in this circle has always been the data collection and aggregation that comes along with the exercise itself. People are, I think, not necessarily aware of how difficult it is always to access information to even understand where we are from a baseline perspective. Just being able to uniformly collect that information from the private and public agencies and being able to aggregate and compare those models on forecasts alone was a feat in and of itself. So I think initially what I would say, as someone who's an economist in the panel, is to a degree you could address that, but the more practical thing to do would be to build off of the process to begin to understand what the other forecasts look like.
Good. I believe that is your.
The gentleman in the back corner.
Good. I'm not going to. Wait. Sorry.
You can just speak.
Hello, everybody. My name is Hashim. I have a background in electric power systems, and I currently work at a startup focused on integrating power electronics in the distribution system. My question is related to my background as an R&D person, as a commercializing R&D products. If we look at the economic landscape and the technological landscape, we see that a lot of the times new technologies that transform the tech space and produce economic growth come from small startup companies. Now, if we look at the energy field, the power transmission and distribution field, we see that a lot of the times it's hard for small tech companies to crack into this market because it's heavily regulated and mainly monopolized by super large corporations. Now, as a state, how can we implement strategic plans to push and allow for small hard tech companies to push for innovative technologies that would push for more sustainability into the power system?
It's a great question. Who wants to start on that one? Smarty, thank you. You're doing great. We're running you all over the room. Thank you.
Yeah, great job.
10,000 steps.
Thanks. Great question. And just in terms of data and numbers, what you said is accurate in terms of what fuels our economy. We did some research a few years ago, just looking at 10 years of longitudinal job creation data, right, for the Commonwealth of Pennsylvania to ascertain and understand. Pretty basic question that we all do in economic development, like who creates jobs, right? And what we found out, it's really just a thin slice of companies that do that, right? It was almost half of the net new jobs in the Commonwealth of Pennsylvania over a 10-year data set that included the Great Recession. Over half the net new jobs came from less than 1% of the companies. So it was a small group, and they were small, nimble companies. We saw the greatest growth in startups, and we saw scale destruction from larger companies. So a key to our future is an entrepreneurial ecosystem, right? Like to make sure that we can drive that going forward. And baked within the scenarios, I think entrepreneurship's got a good shot in both, frankly. I think one of the good outcomes, I think, in a reverse scenario is a cohesive statewide strategy for economic development in some way, which we have had a challenge getting with divided government over the last several years. And frankly, with a good federal tide, there hasn't been a reason. Pennsylvania, when you look at our economic structure is one of the more diverse economies in the country. There's certain indexes where you can understand where we're at. And there's a reason if you look at long periods of time, we don't necessarily experience the highs of highs or the lows of low because we have a pretty diverse economy. We're not a Texas that's wholly dependent upon energy exports, or Washington, while Amazon gets the headlines and Microsoft, a big driver in their economy is Boeing as well, and the exports that they can get out of northwestern Pennsylvania, but they have bigger dips and dives than that. So it's incumbent upon us now in Pennsylvania, how do we're somewhat interested in some of those higher highs, right? So I think an entrepreneurial ecosystem, if you look at rivers, I think a strategy would involve more dedicated research and development in schools and investment in in institutions like CMU, right? Like in building upon our assets. When Pennsylvania did not get Amazon, I hear it a lot in a lot of the meetings I have of legislators and board members. And my line has been, like, I'd like us to focus on what we have instead of what we do not have, right, in Pennsylvania. And I think assets like CMU and what you've done here in building partnerships with some of these larger companies is invaluable. And I think in Rivers, the real value there is a cohesive statewide strategy that focuses on those different areas to drive and to build those connections. On the other hand, Roots really has a focus on communities. And what I've found through my experience in economic development is graduates and entrepreneurs look for place, right? You look for a place to go. When I talk to entrepreneurs, they necessarily don't talk about the company itself. They talk about a place they want to go to see that drive and to see to go to do that. So I think the availability and accessibility of low-cost energy is going to be important no matter what, to drive that system. But I think a focus and the ability for communities to really drive change and Roots is of value as well. So I think, both stories, I want to keep it rooted in, the scenarios today. Glad to have an offline conversation broader about entrepreneurial ecosystem. I work a lot with Tim in the state on how we can best do that. But I think both scenarios have a to say in that.
So I think Sharon in the back over there.
Thank you. My name is Jerry Thompson. I thought one of the more interesting comments, I think Adam made it, was how the actual future as it unfolds is likely to be some combination of these two storylines. Another point of convergence could be, and you made the point that natural gas and renewables would be part of the foreseeable path forward. Was there any discussion in the group about decarbonization of natural gas?
Well, I feel like you two have better memories than I do.
I wouldn't go with my memory, but no, there was a lot of conversation. I don't recall how many meetings we had, but every meeting we would go down and down the track of talking about decarbonization, CCS, and whether it's commercializable, what time horizon we think it is, what the driver is, what price and carbon you need to drive commercialization of CCS. It was absolutely integral to the product, even though it only appears somewhat tangentially into the presentation, the final product here, but absolutely across the board, very fundamental conversations about the important and the need, and certainly in the Rivers conversation, fundamentally needs to be there on natural gas side to get the reductions that we were modeling. So, yeah,
I just will say fun. So, I think what we also recognized in the room, to build off of what Andrew said, is that, again, this is a real leadership opportunity that we saw for Pennsylvania. I think there were a variety of us in the room who were representative of maybe more of the research sectors at the time, and we're just conscious of how much universities play a critical role in kind of our economic development overall, but also, again, keeping in mind that, again, no one has really figured out how that works well. We hear, gas is a transition fuel all the time, but the people who have done that in places where, their consumers have paid. So I think we really also saw, we not only had that discussion, but I think it was a really central piece of our conversations, because we eventually really began to see it as a place where we could take the lead on helping to define that going forward.
I just had a quick comment on the last point.
Sure, you just keep going, Sharon.
Okay.
Right. We'll let you talk. We'll give you a second.
Okay.
Thank you so much.
Thank you so much. My name is Sharon Pillar, and I wear a couple hats. One of them is I co-lead a coalition of 70 renewable energy companies in Pennsylvania, and we've openly are advocating for more aggressive policies in Pennsylvania because we see it as a huge economic development potential in Pennsylvania. Lots of jobs. Another hat that I wear is with E2, Environmental Entrepreneurs, and they just released, just yesterday, their 2019 report showing that we have almost 91,000 people working in the clean energy economy in Pennsylvania. Most of those are energy efficiency, but we have almost 10,000 people working in renewable energy. That's with just about less than 5% of our energy coming from renewables. So most of those people are small businesses, and that is a huge opportunity to work in the small business all across Pennsylvania and rural areas as well. So I just wanted to add that, but this is a really interesting exercise. To be honest, I'm not really clear of what these two scenarios and how the energy is how that's all spelled out. It's kind of fuzzy the way it's honestly being presented. So I would encourage you as you move forward, and also the goal in doing this, I'm not quite clear on that. And I think, as I've heard, there's a goal to do a more holistic energy policy in Pennsylvania, which I think all of us would really like to have. That would be fabulous. I was a little concerned that I didn't see a lot of focus on renewables, given the growth in the renewable sector that we know is happening around the country, and we see it's happening here in Pennsylvania. And I think that crosses over both your scenarios in a huge way. I'm sitting here with a letter from Hector Township in Potter County, where they just built a 90-megawatt wind farm up there, and that municipality, and my mother lived in Hector Township in Potter Town. It's tiny, very most rural place you can be. They're getting $160,000 a year from this development. This is, and we're just seeing prospecting happening around with huge, large-scale renewables, but also distributed generation. So in both your scenarios, we see renewables crossing over that. You know, the distributed stuff is small compared to what's going to be and is happening on the utility scale end of it. So.
Thank you for the question.
So I'll start, and I'm sure other panelists may jump in as well. We definitely appreciate your comments on, you know, how to improve what we're presenting, and we'll certainly take that back and think through how to do that. I would, and one of the things that we should have said at the start was there is a narrative that accompanies this work, and it's on PennsylvaniaEnergyHorizons.org, and the narrative goes into a much deeper dive into both of the stories and provides the context that you probably maybe didn't have coming into this. So our bad there, and we will try to make sure that folks know there's actually a written piece of this that goes with it. And in just an hour-long presentation, which we think is pretty long, we've cut out a lot, really, because it just takes a while to explain. And it's a little risky in some ways because the work is very complex. The work itself was complex. It took over a year to really break through the modeling component and how that will relate to plausible stories. With regard to your question about what the point of all of this is, we had no greater need out of this process than to start a conversation around energy that was multidimensional and that addressed all the different aspects of the energy system in a more holistic way, and the pressures that are on that system that are impeding our ability to move forward in any particular direction, particularly towards decarbonization. There is certainly a component of renewables vested in both stories, and so that was at the forethought really of everyone in the room as to how to integrate renewables, but also a recognition that today we have a diverse energy system, and that within that 25-year context, how much can we get in with those pressures pushing against it? So those are my thoughts for you.
Yeah, I might just add a little bit of color. Yeah, I was thinking back of all the meetings we had over the year plus that we did this. There was a lot of conversation about renewables. And perhaps one of the takeaways from the scenarios is a certain pessimism, perhaps, that renewables where they will plateau. I think we had 200-something% increase in the roots and 268% or something in the river. Substantial increase from where we are today, but not earth-shattering, not quantitatively hugely different. But when you think about the granularity of the conversation, you're asking questions. What do you think the price of carbon would be? What do you think the appetite for a more robust APS would be in the Commonwealth? And the 35 people around the room are coming to a somewhat pessimistic perspective that in 2040 this was what we think it might look like. But it's also perhaps a call to arms for folks to say, look, if you've got a lot of people who live and breathe and swim the deep end here are saying that this is, and we're only seeing a 200% increase over that time horizon. Well, there's need for a stronger political will and stronger focus on these issues. So in many ways, it's arguing for eliciting a possible future, not prescribing where we would hope to be. So.
And the only thing I would add about the renewables piece, besides echoing everything that was just said, is that in each scenario there are huge percent changes from 2015 to 2040 when it comes to renewables penetration in the power sector. Because of the slower growth of produced electricity in rivers, renewables ends up being about 20% of power sector electricity generation, which I think, to Andrew's point about there being a certain underlying pessimism, I think that's absolutely correct. But at the same time, that's a substantial growth in 20 years. And I certainly agree that there's a lot of, there's a lot of momentum behind, the growth of renewables. And then I would sort of go back to what I said earlier about, if 20% of renewables, and if you look at it from a pie chart, and it's 20% of the pie is insufficient from a normative perspective or from any individual or trade perspective, what do we need to do to increase that number and to increase not the size of the pie but the size of the slice? And then just to reiterate, and I think I mentioned it when I went over roots, it's about 12% in roots. It's a similar percent increase, but the size of the pie changes so much. And goodness knows we had a lot of discussions as to how we would present the data. Would it be pie charts, percent increases? We went a lot of times with the delta between 2015 and 2040. So
I think we have time for Pat's comments. We are almost at time. I apologize. I think we'll have one more question.
I have 1 minute, so I'll be very quick.
One comment.
One quick comment. Jerry Thompson beat me to my question, but I had the chance to go to a forum, an international forum at MIT a couple weeks ago about hydrogen and how can it be the answer to decarbonization. And it has to do, Andrew, with separating the CO2 from natural gas. But Cummins Engine was the sponsor, and my comment was, I think that's interesting. They said 53% of oil and gas in the world is used for transportation, 13% for manufacturing. So electrical generation is a significant issue, but it certainly isn't the whole problem. And if there were a way to address the cost issue of sequestration, then the energy is still in the hydrogen or the ammonia, depending on whether you use the gas or liquid form. And it's not just electrical generation, but also manufacturing. So nobody had the answers, but there's a lot of great thinking going on around. It's a very serious issue worldwide, how to use gas rather than keep the gas in the ground, how to use it to help solve more than just the electrical generation problem.
I thank you all for being here today. I really appreciated hearing everything you've been working on. I'm Joelle Salerno. I'm the Government Affairs Director for the National Electrical Contractors Association here in Western PA. And my question is, are you going to use this, do you have any plans to use this framework as a baseline to bring together stakeholders to work on policy moving forward using this?
Thanks for the concluding question. That was well done. First of all, and again, my coworkers assume me about being obsessed with pronouns. So, whereas we're a we organization, not an I organization, and I guess in your reference about what we are gonna do with it, we consider it to be a collective we too. It's not these aren't our scenarios to deploy and utilize. We consider these to be tools for multiple policymakers. Now, ideally, that would be at that same table together, working towards a rational middle and solution to go forward in this work. And Denise is going to touch a little bit upon that with her new role and how that fits in. And as we do that, I'd encourage us to think, big. And that's what while I have some tendency to go back and forth between the scenarios to which one resonates more with me, coming from a small town and believing and understanding what Pennsylvania is in terms of that roots, but the opportunities that present itself within a rivers scenario. Back to that conversation that was referenced earlier about entrepreneurial ecosystems and how do we build upon that, and then not to use the dirty A word again, Amazon's actually a very good investor in Pennsylvania, though. Amazon made a decision to go to Virginia, and one of the reasons referenced was the investment that Virginia Tech was making in the Crystal City and Northern Virginia area. The state had put in $250 million. They were going to raise about $750 more through their own coffers and also public-private partnerships. That decision was made a year prior to that. So that was already done. That groundwork was already laid. So I'd encourage us to think big as well in Pennsylvania in terms of what's going to be our moonshot, what's going to be that fertilizer that helps bring those types of projects going forward.
Well, I'm being handed the microphone, so I believe that I have to have something to say. And what will that be?
As the executive director.
I'm going to keep this short and sweet and just say that, mimicking some information that was on the slides, that Pennsylvania is really a great place to live, to work, to play. We have tremendous opportunities in front of us, and we are an energy powerhouse, and we should be able to transform our own state as a model for the world. And this kind of thinking is necessary if we are to advance the ways and means in which we do things and how we make big collective decisions together. So we're really just here to share that with you today. And we don't want to make more of this than what it is. These are two stories, but the way in which the stories were developed is comprehensive. It has elements that cross-cut all the important issues around energy, and this thinking is necessary to advance forward. So really, this is a tool. Like, we go back to the basics. It's a tool, and it's a tool intended to start a serious conversation around energy and what we need to be in the future.